Joining us now for more on this is retired Major General Scott Clancy, former Director of Operations for NORAD. First of all, Major General, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you very much for having me.
So we have all been waiting to see when Israel will begin this ground offensive. Some say that it feels like it has already begun, but this invasion, ground incursion that everyone is bracing for, it seems like it will be imminent because of what we've heard from the Israeli Prime Minister's advisor saying that Hamas will feel Israel's wrath tonight. How are you taking those words?
Well, I think his words are pretty inflammatory as it pertains to the military portion of the conflict. I know that the Israeli Defense Force themselves issued statements, small statements today to a small group of journalists saying that they were expanding or extending their operation. And then the other indication I think that we have that significant ground operations are imminent is that over the course of the last 72 hours, we've seen raids being conducted by the Israeli Defense Forces into Gaza and then withdrawing. And then this evening, they've isolated the battle space inside of Gaza by turning off cell phone and telephone coverage in order to affect their operations. To me, those are the indications of a pending ground offensive.
When it comes to what Israel is trying to target with these strikes, who they're trying to target, these strikes are happening in many different places in Gaza amid this humanitarian crisis. What is the goal for Israel at this point?
I think the goal has been stable throughout the conflict, which is defeating, in a finality kind of point of view, Hamas, the terrorist organization that is Hamas. So, to be quite frank, the Israeli Defense Forces have a right and a responsibility to defend Israel from Hamas. Hamas is placing civilians between, the Israeli Defense Forces and themselves. By doing so, they're the ones that are, making sure that civilian casualties are part of this calculus, as opposed to identifying themselves as a military force so that they can go one-on-one with the IDF. Now, that's problematic. And the fact that civilians are being killed on both sides is horrific. The IDF still has a job that it has to do, and Hamas is the ones that are perpetrating these acts of horror because they're the ones that are placing their forces right beside civilian targets.
There is, at the same time, as I was mentioning, that humanitarian crisis, this call from the UN, the overwhelming vote in favor of a resolution that was calling for a humanitarian truce in this war. Does that bear any weight when it comes to this conflict? How much power does that have?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think it bears too much weight with the Israelis and the Israeli Defense Forces. And so it turns to the international community to place that pressure on Israel to enable them to open up those corridors. I personally think that it would be very beneficial to the Israeli Defense Forces and Israel to open those corridors and do a more deliberate humanitarian approach to how their operations are going to be conducted. I think changes the fact that they have the responsibility to go in and to defeat Hamas, but in doing so in a more humane way, in doing so in a way in which they can guarantee the civilian population's survival in a better fashion, and to be able to delineate between civilian and military targets of Hamas, that's going to be fundamental. I think what the international community is going to struggle with is trying to convince Israel that that just doesn't mean that they have to accept Hamas being in Gaza and this conflict now goes away without a ground invasion.
If this ground invasion begins tonight, if that's what actually happens, what happens to the hostage negotiations for the more than 200 still in Gaza? What happens to the Canadians, the hundreds of Canadians who still need to get out?
Yes, so I think that I look at the hostages and I look at the foreign nationals that are in Gaza and then the civilian population as, 1, 2, 3 of the people that were not party to any part of this conflict and don't want to be, and yet are caught up in it. And you ask a great question with respect to what happens to them. Obviously, I can't foresee this. One, Hamas is a terrorist organization that will do anything. And they said from the beginning, don't conduct ground operations or that'll be the end of the hostages. So obviously that's a large threat. But that means that the onus still remains to be on Hamas. So now the Americans have said that it doesn't matter what happens with respect to the Israeli Defense Forces, they will always be conducting negotiations to try to free the hostages, all hostages. And I think Canada takes the same approach, and that diplomacy never stops, even during conflict.
Retired Major General Scott Clancy, former Director of Operations for NORAD, joining us on this. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much.